Okay, welcome to another edition of Ragged Theology podcast. I'm delighted to be welcomed by Andy Constable from Niddrie Community Church and Ian Williamson from New Life Middlesbrough. Welcome, guys.
Cheers, Andy. Good to be here.
So this is a no cheeky banter zone, so just to warn you before we start, okay? So tell us about yourselves, guys. Where are you from? Your family? Andy, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm married to Debbie, 10 years married, got 3 kids. Isla's 6, Isaac's 3, and Ezra's 1. I have to think about that. Working in Edinburgh as a pastor at a church called Niddrie Community Church in Niddrie.
And where do you come from, Andy?
Hail from London originally, and I've been in Scotland for 17 years, nearly half my life.
Well, you know, we were doing a thing on Zoom with my team recently, and we all had to say something that would surprise us. It would surprise everyone about you. And I told my team that I was born in London, which caused great shock. So, born in Wembley.
Well done. Respect's gone up.
So, Ian, where are you from? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Ian Williamson. I'm pastor of New Life Church in Middlesbrough. I'm married to Rachel. We've been married 16 years. I've got 2 daughters, Hannah, who's 19 and a student nurse, and Esther, who is 12, and we're currently homeschooling Esther. Been in Middlesbrough my whole life, born and bred. I went to London for 3 months and realised it was a dump. So I came back to Middlesbrough. No, it was lovely. I enjoyed London, actually. It was just, I don't think London enjoyed me, so I came home.
Too expensive for you.
Oh, mate. And no one talks to me. I never shut up to her, so everyone just thought I was an escapee from an asylum or something. So
that's what we all think.
Tell us a bit about your own kind of faith journey, guys, and your journey into kind of full-time Christian work. Do you want to go first, Ian?
Yeah. So it was funny. I went to a Church of England school as a young boy. So we had to have assemblies every morning. The Bible was taught in a way. We'd have hymns and learnt about Jesus. My favourite book was the storybook Bible. And the family wasn't religious. I just got given one because we got christened like everyone else did. And everyone went to a school and heard about God. But God always made sense to me. I always believed in God. And my dad left when we were about 8. And I remember that was the first time I prayed outside of school assembly, was when I was praying, asking God not to let my dad leave. But that never happened. My dad still went. I grew up on various council estates in Middlesbrough. I was an odd one out, so I was often bullied and responded by fighting back. And by the time I was 18, I was taking drugs, involved in violence, womanizing, drinking, and just spent my life constantly searching for happiness. I thought it might be found in finance, so I ended up getting a job working offshore. I was based in Aberdeen, and I was working on the oil rigs, and I had plenty of money to spare, yet that didn't make me happy. I thought maybe if I got a degree, I'd feel better about myself. So I went to uni and then only did a year there, then dropped out. I managed bars. I ended up getting a real bad addiction, did a runner from my job as a pub manager. Took the takings from the safe. So I ended up not only losing my home, but my job. And I was working the doors, taking drugs. Every night I was working the doors, I was full of fear. So I'd take drugs to hide from that fear, and then I'd do something crazy on the drugs, which would just cause more fear. It was a vicious circle. And then one day I was in so much debt. I was arguing with my mum about ordering a pizza, and when she'd made me some tea, I'd split with my girlfriend and that and moved back home. I was 28, and I can't believe I'm getting told off by my mum for eating a pizza. Is this what my life's come to? And I just felt like I'd wasted my whole life and I had nothing worth living for. And I pulled out a knife and I threatened to kill myself in front of my brother and my mum and my stepdad. Everyone was shocked. They thought I was just this happy-go-lucky lad without a care in the world. And then I shared about my addictions, the debt I was in, the fear and pain I was going through. And my mum had become a Christian, and she said, that Jesus could help me, which just made me furious. I was like, what you going to do? Write me a check for 40 grand? And that just like, it didn't bring comfort to me. But she was honest. She said, I don't know how Jesus can help you, but I know he can. Can I pray for you? And she prayed for me. And that started a journey that took me over about 3 months. I started working as a family worker in a church that I used to go to as a child, met some Christians who I knew from when I was a child. And I was reminded of a verse that was shared with me, Psalm 68, verse 5, about God being a father to the fatherless. And that got me thinking, and I knew I needed a saviour. I was crying out to God to save me, but I didn't realise what I needed saving from. I felt like a victim. And this night I was praying, it suddenly dawned on me that, hang on, I needed saving from myself and from my own sin, and that I wasn't a victim, I was a perpetrator. And I just cried out to God and said, look, God, if you help me, I will follow you. And I will try and change. And that was back in 2003. And it's been a long, hard slog since. But through God's grace, I'm seeing sanctification. And I'm free from the debt of sin and the debt of finance. So I'm no longer in debt to God, which was my biggest problem. And I'm married with 2 children, and I'm able to pastor to men and women with similar lifestyles that I had.
Great. So basically, a pizza brought you to Christ. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, can't even remember what flavour it was.
Pizza evangelism. Andy, any pizzas in your life? Or?
Plenty of pizzas. None of them led me to Christ. Quite a different upbringing to Ian. So brought up in a Christian home down in London. Mum and dad became believers when they were younger, and both had stable jobs, and raised us up in the church, taught me the gospel, taught me the Bible story from when I was young. But typical kind of teenage years when you're trying to grapple with faith, the Bible, what it means, is it relevant for my life? I had those years where I kind of put church and Christian things on the back burner. I was never a mad person, never went drinking or taking drugs. I've always been an early nighter, an early riser. So nothing exciting in that way, but just still as a teenager, full of jealousy, full of anger, full of lust. I think that probably would be my the biggest kind of habitual sin I had in my life as a teenager. The usual stuff, pornography, and lust and temptation in that way. And I was just really unhappy as well. And I just remember when I was 18 I'd not been to church for a few years, and for some reason I went back to church for a service, and the guy preached on Isaiah chapter 1, and he talked about the Israelites just walking away from the Lord time and time again, and yet God had made a way for them to come back to him. Though your sins are like scarlet, they can be made white as snow, as it says in chapter 1. And that just struck me to the heart. I mean, I'd heard the gospel so many times, but on that night, for some reason, the Spirit kind of descended on me, and I felt a very heavy conviction for my sins. And I just realized I needed to repent and put my faith in Christ. And I remember going back to my house that night, and just sitting in my room and weeping over my sins, just understanding just the depth of my sin, of my disobedience against my parents, the levels of lust in my life, jealousy, anger, the whole thing just was very clear to me that I was a sinner, and but at the same time knew that Christ had forgiven me, and just made a commitment that night that wherever Christ called me to, I would go. Wherever he called me to, I would go, and I would want to follow him the rest of my life. So from there, went to university, been to Cape Town, South Africa, and then the last 10 or so years been in Niddrie, pastoring at Niddrie Community Church. So that's my journey.
And when you both look at your own journey into pastoral work, who's been your inspiration? Who's somebody that you go back to time and time again, apart from Thomas Guthrie? Who else?
the pizza delivery boy.
I guess I'm asking who who's your kind of model of ministry. Obviously Christ, but who else has inspired you?
So for me, I didn't really intend to go into this type of ministry. I was working in a school, and I was offered a chance to work in a prison ministry, which I just wanted to get out of the school, to be honest. So that was good. I enjoyed it for a time, but I didn't see ministry for men like me. I didn't see many people, unless you were going to go to university, which I couldn't afford to do, especially just getting saved with all that debt and then being married for the first time and having a family. So I think the first person who I saw preaching who was working class was a guy called Graham Seed, and I worked alongside him for a bit in the prison ministries, but there wasn't really anyone who I could look to. I had no training, so I didn't have a clue about church history. When people mentioned church history, I was like, well, what do we need that for? We've got a Bible. I'm just interested in Jesus. So I came with a very naive idea of what ministry was and about following tradition and learning from the forefathers and things like that. And I basically just looked at Jesus and saw how he was. Mark 2, where Jesus is in the building and people came to him, and then he goes to the market, and then he goes and eats with sinners. So I tried to model my ministry on that style of thing, where it's not just waiting for people to come to church, but going out to where people are, and not just meeting them in the street, but also spending time with them in the home, in my home, and in their home, and being alongside them. But as I grew in my faith, as I started in my Christian learning, I started doing some theology courses, and I think the people who stood out to me most would have been more recent church history guys, the fellas like Christmas Evans, who I could relate to because he grew up fatherless. He had a bit of a rough life, was a bit of a headbanger, had his eye kicked out in a fight and things like that. So I finally started seeing men in past history who were similar to me and I could relate to. But I think more recently, it would be probably more African-American preachers and pastors. So Dr. Robert Smith, he's a guy from out in the States who I really admire and look at his work. And I'd probably say, H.B. Charles more now. I probably listen and read some of his stuff. So I'd probably be more the modern era rather than going back to like the Nicene Creed and things like that. Pretty much because I've not studied that much. I've needed to have a pretty compact theological training because I was just straight on the field, where if I'd have got saved earlier, I'd have loved the opportunity to have studied. And what I'm hoping to is, as the pressure of ministry eases, as I've now got an associate pastor, that I can revisit some theological training, and hopefully I can learn from some of these early church fathers as much as I have from the modern preachers and pastors that I've learned from.
Cool. What about yourself, Andy?
Yeah, I think biggest influences on my life, first is my dad. He just modeled godly Christian faith in the home on a day-by-day basis. Sacrificial with his time. Always treat everyone with the same respect and dignity. I always say this about him, that my dad did well in business and still works in the city centre of London. And I remember doing some work placements at his business, and the way that he treated the doorman was exactly the same way he treated the CEO of the company. The way he treated the janitor was exactly the same way as he treated any other person that he met. So just the respect and that he would give people. We'd have people in and out of our homes when we were younger as well, just strangers we didn't know. Mum and Dad would take them in, and we'd have a spare room and put people up. So that all those things just had a real big impact on me, just seeing that in his life and trying to model it in some way in mine. And then in terms of theological writers, the first person I kind of read when I became a Christian was John Piper. So his book, Don't Waste Your Life, had a big big impact on me, just because he was just like, if you've got one life, you've got to use it. You're going to die soon, so don't waste it. And that had a real big impact on me. I don't want to be a half-hearted Christian. I don't go into ministry and just coast it. I want to go all out for Christ and go out with a bang if I can. So that really challenged and encouraged me. And then the last person was from church history is Hudson Taylor. Again, got my hand on some of his biographies, and just the way that he lived simple life of faith just always challenged me and encouraged me as well. So those guys have probably been biggest impact in my life, outside of Mezzanine as well.
Yeah, Ian's been a big inspiration to me as well. So just you're both ministering in schemes. What are some of the unique challenges about ministering in schemes? I'm sure there's tons of issues, but maybe if you just pick maybe three each. Ian, maybe you go first.
Sorry, what was that? The challenges?
Yeah, the challenges of ministering in schemes.
So for me, I've probably got the opposite challenges to someone like Andy or for Nathan. So first of all, like, I have massive respect for someone who's a cultural outsider who moves onto a housing estate, because they face all kinds of challenges. But I think for me, being Indigenous to the council estate, the main challenge I've had is my past life. I can't escape it. Whereas, don't want to get into too much details, but there's people I see every day. I'm reminded of past sin. I'm reminded of things that I've done that I regret, and that's a challenge. My pride, and I'm constantly reminded that I'm a sinner. I'm reminded of fears. I still have fears, and I wasn't the most popular. I wasn't like the most hated, but neither was I the most popular. And I think because I'm in a ministry now where I love people and people love me, I forget my past life. Every now and again, I'll bump into somebody who doesn't think I'm as great as my wife and kids does, and that's tough to deal with. So I think the main thing is my past. I can't escape from my past. I often dream about not being in Middlesbrough, but then in the same breath, I've got such a burden for the place as well. So I feel like caught between two worlds. I'd like to run away and hide, but I also don't want to do that, because I know there's God has chosen people just like me who need to hear the word and need to be saved. And so I think there's that conflict of interest. And I think the biggest problem that I've had is my own sin. And I look back and regret understanding that God is sovereign. But I think if I was distracted less with chasing temptation, succumbing to temptation, and then feeling guilty about my sin, how much more effective could I have been for the Lord? So, I think that out of all the things that I find challenging is probably my past and present sin. that will be it, I'll imagine. And what I found is when I'm trusting in Jesus, when he is my Lord and Savior, when he is my focus, when I'm faced with trouble or difficulties, I have a peace and make good decisions and handle things well. And when I'm stressed and feel like packing in, it's usually first and foremost because my walk with the Lord isn't how it should be. So I faced trials of the church almost shut financially because we didn't have any backers. That was tough, but if I'd been walking right with the Lord, I'd have handled it better. And the same when we're working with people who need to be excommunicated. Every decision or action that I've done badly as a pastor hasn't been the result of others. It's been the result of my walk with God not being as strong. And I think that stems from some of it's to do with my past and not trusting in God and trying to do things in my own strength. And then other things is to do with my pride. I forget that Jesus is building his church and not Ian Williamson. And now I'm trying to build myself a little kingdom. I felt that people weren't listening to me when we started the church about the needs that we had. And because we weren't getting the support or the help that I felt that we needed, it then became my ambition to prove people wrong. And then I didn't want to grow the church for the glory of God and for the sake of the lost in Middlesbrough. At times I'd want to grow the church so I could say, look what this kid from the council estate's done and you haven't helped. And it become a massive symbol of pride for me. And I think that's why God brought me to my knees when the church nearly shut down financially, because I had to make a decision. Who am I doing this for? Am I doing this for the glory of God and for the sake of the lost in Middlesbrough? Because if I am, I can do that from my home. I don't need a church building and I don't need a full-time salary. I can preach the gospel if I'm working bivocationally or full-time. Or am I doing this for the sake of Ian Williamson and his kingdom? And I realised, no, I could have got a job. Mez had offered me a job elsewhere and I could have taken that job, but I didn't need to pay a mortgage. I didn't feel called. If I just wanted to pay a mortgage, I'd have got a job as a postman. And I realised that I had a calling to Middlesbrough. And and I think God has used these trials to show me that first and foremost, I need to be right with him. And I don't know if I've answered the question or gone off track, but basically the biggest challenges for Counsel Estate Ministry is my own personal sin.
Andy, what about yourself? What are some of the challenges in Niddrie?
So, I mean, I'll start myself as well, because I think that's a helpful place to start. But I think for me, over the last year being in lockdown, the two sins that have kind of come to the front has been contentment and impatience. I think they're been my two biggest kind of sin problems in ministry and just personally as well. I've always had a battle with being content in working in a scheme in Scotland. It was never my dream to be in Scotland for the rest of my life in a scheme. I had high ambitions of going across the seas, doing something exciting in South Africa or China or I don't know, South America, somewhere a bit more glamorous than a scheme in Scotland. So that's always been my battle, to have my head screwed on here and to be thankful for the ministry that God has given me here, rather than think I need to be over there or doing that. So that's been a battle that probably in the last couple of years I've managed to make peace with that situation. Patience is another thing. Just it's easy to be impatient, isn't it, in ministry? And ministry anywhere is difficult and slow. That's what Jesus said it was going to be like. But particularly in a scheme, it's difficult because you're not working with a group of people who've been brought up knowing the Bible, going to church, really. You're not coming into a church where you've got lots of kind of Christian families with Christian teens who are, making professions of faith, etc. You're literally working with a completely pagan community who know nothing about the gospel, and reaching them is easy, but the discipleship afterwards is really, really difficult. And so that's been part of a personal battle of patience with people who don't seem to be growing in sanctification very quickly, and also having patience with people in general when they walk away from the Lord as well, and being gracious towards them. And so one of the biggest difficulties is, we've seen lots of people converted or make professions of faith. We've seen lots of people be baptized in Niddrie, but very few have stuck it out, and that's a painful process to go through, and painful to watch, but also to experience, and to keep your heart soft to God and also the people that you're working with as well, because it's easy, isn't it, in ministry to, I think, harden your heart to both God and people and just say, screw you guys, I'm just going to focus on myself and my own family now, because this is not working, rather than relying on God, remembering the gospel is powerful and that God's timing is perfect, and we have to wait upon him, and that change of a culture and a community doesn't happen overnight, but happens soul by soul, as they're one and discipled in the Christian faith. So yeah, that'll probably be my own battle, and also that battle in the community as well.
I remember talking to you, Andy, years ago about church revitalisation, and you mentioned a number of things that had helped in the revitalisation of Niddrie Community Church. I don't know if you remember what they were.
No.
You mentioned, moving into the area, long-term commitment, the church being open regularly, women's ministry, intentional discipleship. I think those were the things you mentioned. Is that right?
Yes.
They all probably began with the same letter, but I can't remember. So you're obviously both working in areas where there's high levels of addiction. How do you approach discipling people with addictions? The general approach to addiction in society or in health services is copious amounts of methadone, basically harm reduction, I suppose. What would your own approach to working with people with addictions be? Ian, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my first step is cynicism. I'm quite cynical when an addict comes to me, and I think that probably comes from being one myself. I wanted help with my addiction, not because I wanted to get off the drugs, but because I wanted to get rid of the debt, because I wanted to stop the problems. So I'd have been quite happy to stay on cocaine for the rest of my life if it didn't get me into debt, if it didn't cost me my relationships, if it didn't cost. So the things I wanted fixing wasn't the addiction, it was the trouble that it brought.
Consequences.
So a lot of people I speak with is the same thing. So my understanding was, I got saved, and when I was saved, I still loved cocaine. So I stopped taking it because you shouldn't take drugs as a Christian. But then every time Jesus wasn't enough, I'd run straight back to the cocaine. And I was probably 5 years in before I didn't take another drug. And I had a wife, I had children, I had a good job, and I still went out one night and took drugs, and I got into a horrendous fight, and I could have ended up in jail or dead or lost everything. And that was the first time I sobered up, like, immediately, and I really felt God saying, this is like your last chance. So you were like a baby, and I protected you from the fire. Next time you go near the flames, you're getting burnt. So I didn't hear that audibly, but it was just, when you just think, I've pushed my luck too far this time. It's either one way or the other. And that was when I realized I love Jesus more than the drug. And that didn't come from methadone. It didn't come from a 12-step program. It come from reading the Bible daily, praying, discipleship, listening to sermons. And so for me, I'm not saying that isn't necessary, but for me, the only way I got free from addiction was through the gospel. And it was a process. So I try and take a similar act with the people that I'm discipling. I want to see is, what is the motivation? Do I want to be off the drugs? Is it because the wife's left them or the husband's left them? Is it, do you know what I mean? What is the motivation? Because if somebody just wants to be free from the drug for anything other than the gospel, I can't help them. It's only if they want to follow Jesus that I can help addicts. What I will do is I'll point them to a rehab or to a 12-step program. So the first thing I think is, do you want to know Jesus? Because my job's a pastor, not an addiction counsellor. But I can counsel addicts with the gospel, and that's all I can do.
I think the big question for me is, when somebody's got such a big thing as addiction in their life, is if they're going to get rid of it, what are they going to fill it with, because we all know that if they don't fill it with something, it's just going to, the drugs and the drink are going to rush back in.
Well, have you seen my blind date video? That's what I was like. I was that weight when I was an addict. I was about 12 stone, and I'm 20 stone now. So you can see, I don't always replace my addiction with Jesus. Sometimes it's a big fat beef burger.
Hamburgers. Have you yourself, Andy?
We all have it, don't we? And that, our biggest addiction is sin, and we will fill our desires with anything that makes us feel better, whether that be sex, whether it be drugs, whether it be food, anything other than Jesus that takes priority over Jesus is an addiction, isn't it? It's sinful. So whether you're a workaholic or an alcoholic, you've got an issue. And the only issue that you can deal with is by using the gospel. But just let me quickly share those. I know addicts who have died after professing and being baptized, but praise the Lord because they were still saved. So a continuing addiction doesn't mean that there's no sanctification or salvation. So there is psychological and medical issues that doesn't prevent you from being saved. So I know people who've overdosed or died of, the most recent convert we had died of alcoholism, that she'd been an alcoholic for decades before she was saved, and there was nothing. Getting saved didn't save her physically, but she was saved spiritually. So I think having the outlook that our aim is always salvation and not being set free from addiction. So there's addicts I know who have died through their addiction, but are now set free from addiction in heaven. And I think our motivation always needs to be salvation.
I think there's obviously people who are addicts through trauma, past trauma, and that trauma doesn't stop when somebody becomes a Christian and they have to deal with that. And anyway, Andy.
Yeah, I think the way that we've reached those struggling with addictions in our communities is the same way that we've reached anyone in the community, and that's by living here, by living life, and sharing the gospel with people. I think towards the beginning of our kind of time in Niddrie, we ran like some addiction recovery groups, just because that was a good way of getting to know people, and we could then share the Bible and the gospel with them, and that was a good way to reach different people in the community. But the problem often with addiction recovery groups is that it just becomes all about the addiction, and actually then the addicts just begin to get to know each other even better and deal drugs with each other and go off and drink and whatever else, and it can form a little clique of addicts who are biblicized, which is not always helpful. And it's also not helpful long term, because if you just have an addiction group separate from the church, it means those who become Christians don't always come into the church properly and become members of the church. And what happens is, addicts like to hang out with other addicts rather than a middle-class Christian who's not like them, who can also help them grow in their Christian faith. And so, the way we've done it is sharing the gospel just like we do in any other way, but then also inviting them into the family of God and the church family, and putting lots of different Christians around that person so that they have discipleship, and so they can see what it means to live as a Christian. And I think this is really important because, like you just said, a lot of those who struggle with addictions, they've had trauma in their past, and the reason that they are on drugs or drinks is not because it's a pleasure thing per se, it's because they're running away from pain. And a lot of the addicts that we work with also have not had a stable family. They've not had a father figure in their life. And so what they need in the church is they need father figures. They need godly men and women to help them see what it looks like to follow Christ, and to model what they haven't seen, when they were a child. And so that's why having an AA group or NA group, obviously AA and NA, just they don't preach the gospel at all, and so we never send anyone there. But what happens generally is these groups are very separate, and it's like, oh, I'm Bob and I'm an alcoholic, and that's their identity for the rest of their life. And they'll just hang out with those other AA people. But we say, no, when you come to Christ, you're not an addict anymore. You're a son or daughter of God now. And now you become part of a family of God, where you have some people in that church who've been to prison, and you have some people in that church who haven't been to prison. And the gospel breaks down those barriers. So there's no longer Jew or Gentile, there's no longer working class and middle class. There's no longer drug addict and person who's never taken drugs. We're all one in Christ, growing in godliness. And so I think it's really important that we do our addiction recovery, whatever you want to call it, within the local church body, and do it intentionally and do it well. The other thing as well is just like you said, the consistency of it. Like Ian just intimated there, it took him 5 years before he kind of came completely away from his addiction, or the drugs of his past. And it can take that time, can't it? It's not just overnight sometimes. Some people do get healed of their addiction straight away and they never go back to it, but other people don't, and it's a back and forth. And so that's why it's important that we're patient with people and we're with them over the long haul. And particularly for the first few years, they're going to need 24/7 discipleship, because the whole world has been drinking drugs. That has been their idol, if you like, and they've centered everything in their week around that idol. So the money that they make, the friends that they hang out with. And so when people become Christians, they need a 24/7 church family to come into, where they can be supported and loved and then helped how to deal with stress, how to deal with their money, how to use their time, who should they hang out with, what wisdom should they listen to, how do they say no to sexual temptation and all these things. And that needs to be intentionally discipled and done over a long period of time. So
that's a huge challenge for the church, of course, isn't it? That so many churches are kind of 2 Sunday services and a prayer meeting, 24/7 discipleship's a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's not just that as well. It's the culture in the UK generally of Christianity is a very privatized life, very individualistic life. We've kind of bought into the culture. And so we put the emphasis on the saint rather than the saint and sinner. So we all come on a Sunday as the saints of God, and we all act like our lives are completely together and there's no problems or issues in our lives. Whereas the addict, or usually the person from a kind of poorer background, is very open about their struggles. And they need middle-class Christians or people who've been Christians for longer to also say, I struggle with sin as well, and to share life with each other. And that's a big issue that we need to overcome culturally, not just for working class believers, but for middle class believers. The reason that middle class believers struggle so much with depression and anxiety and all these issues, I think at root is because we're so individualistic. And obviously there's other social factors that play into it. But because we're not willing to share our struggles and we keep things so privatized, we don't have a community as God called us to. And so I think there's that bigger cultural change that needs to happen, as well as that time change and focus as well.
And I think like the issue is with middle class churches is we need to fix a problem. So if there's hunger, we set up a food bank. If there's addicts, we need to set up something for addiction. If there's single parents, we help the single. We're looking at the practical issue, not the spiritual sin issue, and we don't go beyond that. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do practical things to help people in the struggles, but what I'm saying is doing that on its own is pointless. So, and how people measure success is pointless. It's by numbers or food parcels given or addicts clean. My success rate with addicts and seeing them clean is far greater than making disciples. So there's lots of men and women I've worked with who are now free from addiction, but they're going to hell. That is my role, to get people off drugs. My role is to save people from an eternity of suffering and judgment of God. And I think that is the issue I was trying to make earlier, is whatever the reason is that you are an addict, the motivation or the story behind how you became an addict really is irrelevant into you getting clean, because getting clean isn't the answer to your problems. It's if it's trauma that's led you to addiction, that trauma, you need healing. The only way you will be healed is through the gospel. You're being given a false medication in the drug. You need the true healer, which is Jesus. And whether it is pleasure you're seeking, you need to know that it's only through Jesus you can understand true pleasure. If it's a sexual addiction, the only way you can truly enjoy sex is in a godly marriage. So it's always the gospel. And sin is always a problem, and the gospel is always the cure. And we cannot measure success on how many people get off heroin, because if we've got 20 people free from heroin who are still going to hell, then we've failed massively.
Good. So let me just ask you about two separate things. Andy, you're involved at the moment in running the Ragged School in Theology, which is a great name. And Ian, you're involved in a podcast, much more successful than my podcast.
We've got 2 listeners.
See, I've got a big family, you see, so I can always say I've got 5 or 6 listeners, you see. So, Andy, tell us a wee bit about Ragged School and Theology. I know that you're involved in it as well, Ian. I think it's. I mean, when I heard about it, I just think it's fantastic. And you're also studying at Union Seminary. Tell us a wee bit about that. What you've learnt and how you're applying that to your ministry at the moment.
Oh yeah, so just briefly, Ragged School of Theology is kind of our Bible school for Christians who've been converted in housing schemes and council estates. So one of the things that we identified for our believers is that we want to train them in-house in the local church, but we also want to give them a solid theological education. The reason for that is because I think it's biblical for us to be training people in the local church, and also because often seminary education, not always, but in general, is expensive. The language isn't contextualized to our men and women, and often it drags people away from their communities and puts them in a Bible college for 4 years and then takes them out of their context. So what we wanted to offer was affordable, contextualized, but theologically rugged training for men and women who have been converted. So that's why we set it up. So we meet every Wednesday. We do 4 hours of lectures, and we've got about 20 students at the moment. And yeah, they're doing a variety of subjects. We do the Old Testament, we do New Testament, we do preaching, we do planting, we do ecclesiology. So we're doing all the big subjects, church history. But the point is that we're trying to use language and imagery that our guys will understand. And also we're trying to use assessment processes that they're going to be able to be stretched, but also it's going to be helpful for them to kind of process what they're learning. So that's been really encouraging so far. So that's that. And then, yeah, I'm doing my master's at the moment at Union School of Theology. So again, that's long distance, so it's really good. Union are really good at that. They try and do stuff long distance so you can stay within your locale, which is really, really helpful. So yeah, I've been doing all sorts of stuff, some boring stuff, some really interesting stuff. Stuff that's been really helpful. So got to do a course on patristic stuff, and particularly I got to write an essay on hermeneutics.
Just remind me what patristic is again.
So like the early church fathers.
Cool.
And
I was just asking on behalf of Ian there.
And I got to do an essay on kind of interpreting scripture, and that was really helpful for helping me just understand that all our I mean, I knew this already, but just to put it on paper academically, just to understand that all our preaching should be Christ-centered, and why that should be. And actually, historically, particularly the first 500 years, and then obviously the reformers, their preaching was Christ-centered. And in the since the Enlightenment, pretty much, preaching in the evangelical church has moved away from that. to just the plain meaning or the literal meaning of the text, which means you just look at the historical level. So you just look at the context, and for example, looking at the Old Testament, you just look at Israel instead of looking deeper to this points to Christ and the church. And so that was really helpful for me just to see that. And then I've been doing some research on pastoral care of addiction, and that's what I'm going to be doing my dissertation on next year. So that's going to be really helpful for us, because I think one of the things that is needed in the church in the UK is a handbook for local churches to know how to disciple and evangelize men and women from addictions, just to understand addictions biblically, and then also thinking about discipleship. So I'm hoping that that paper could be turned into kind of a handbook for local churches to know how best to reach addicts, biblically and gospel-centered, in a gospel-centered way. So yeah.
And Ian, you're a wee bit involved in Ragged's School of Theology. Sometimes you do some of the talks, is that right?
Yeah, so I was doing the talks on preaching and evangelism. That was obviously not being there this year with lockdown, but preaching is a passion of mine, especially as there's not many working class preachers that I'm aware of. So really encouraging young men to from council estates to see that preaching is for them. When you're sat in a church and you see predominantly middle class men who've been to university preaching, you think that's not for me, because A, I'm not middle class, and B, I've not been to university. But as is Spurgeon, I think it was said, seminaries produce scholars, the church produces pastors and preachers, and that is where we should be doing it. So it's not being anti-intellectual, it's making training accessible to people, isn't it? It's not saying that we don't need training, it's making it accessible for those who might not be able to go to seminary, like I wasn't. I was preaching heresy for years until I got training, and the heresy, it wasn't false teaching in the sense of I was trying to con people. It was false teaching because I'd never been trained with the Bible, and I was pretty much read it and tell you, the congregation, what you think it means. So I've had to train myself. I've had to travel for training, and accessing things online. Brian Chappell's Christ-Centered Preaching, that for me was the best book I've ever read on preaching, next to Doctrine That Dances by Dr. Robert Smith. And looking at how can we, Doctrine That Dances is awesome. That is like saying, look, doctrinal preaching doesn't have to be boring. It should flow, it should dance, it should. He talks about imagery and illustrations and repetition, and it excites me, because coming from a working class background, we love telling stories. Like, I can't shut up, can I? I just always waffle on. I naturally use illustrations in my conversations, and to find somebody like Dr. Robert Smith who says that's how we should be preaching was really encouraging, where that style of preaching was knocked out of me when I was training. So when I finally got some good theological training, I assimilated to many of the preachers that I was listening to, and started looking in flipping books on Plato for illustrations. Which might be good if I was speaking to some church in Oxford full of boffins, but speaking to the lads I was preaching to, they don't care what some Greek philosopher thought flipping a couple of 100 years ago. They need to know what the man in the street thought. They want an illustration that applies to them. They want to see, how does Jesus and his word apply to me today? How does it help me with my addictions? How does it help me with my lusts, with my fears? So for me, the Ragged School of Theology is so exciting, and to be part of it is such a blessing to see that the struggles I had when I was coming through, the struggles that Mez had when he was at seminary, hopefully we'll be able to help the next generation of pastors and preachers avoid those struggles and be equipped, and not just do the Ragged Theology, but get on and do a master's like Andy's doing. And again, we're not saying we shouldn't be doing traditional training. What we're saying is we need to make training available for all.
I've been very helped by Ralph Davis as well. The Word Became Fresh. Some of his books are fantastic about keeping preaching very fresh. And Ian, you've launched into the world of podcasting. You're a professional podcaster, not like me. And there's been some promises of your podcast producing hoodies, but I've not seen them yet.
Yeah, they'll be ready in time for the summer. Do you know when we have that 1 week of sun? So,
Get your money first, though.
Yeah, get the money first. We're hoping there's a Christian couple who don't live too far from us who've got their own printing business. So I was ordering them where I get most of my stuff from, but I'm going to ordering it through them. Blessing a Christian couple and keeping the money local.
So the podcast is called In Context Podcast, is that right?
Yeah.
And you've had people like John Piper on, and who else?
Yeah, John Piper, Alistair Begg. Hopefully we want to mix it up so everyone's welcome. So we've got Benny Hinn and Joyce Myers lined up as well. No, we've had Johnny Pry on though. And I've got John Omochekwe. He's coming on tomorrow. He wrote the Book of Prayer, and he's a church planter in Atlanta and involved with something called the Creek Collective. We've got Dr. Robert Smith. He's coming on in April, hopefully. So what we're going to do is trying to get a bit of an eclectic mix of people from council estates, people who are working on council estates, and people who've never been to a council estate. And what I want to do is, what I found was, so part of the training that we've been doing on preaching, we stress how some of the working class people are overlooked because of intentional or unintentional bias, and how our style of preaching is maybe dismissed because we're not traditional. But I want to highlight to our people that they do exactly the same thing. So one day we watched, every week we do a sermon training, watch 2 different sermons, and one morning I put on a sermon by Mays, and everyone was sat there really engaged and listening. And then I put one on by CJ Mahaney. And as soon as he came on, everyone just was like started doodling and switched off. And at the end, I said, why did you do that? And they went, well, did you see the size of his collars? And as soon as this guy had walked out, because he dressed different, they could see he was more academic than us, that he was from a different culture to us. They immediately thought, this guy's got nothing to say to me. So I was showing them that they do exactly what we accuse others of doing. So I want our lads not just to listen to council estate preachers, to learn from us, but also learn from some of the wonderful gifts that the middle class and academic preachers have as well. And I want people to be aware of other issues. A lot of people in our communities feel like victims and think they're the only ones who are suffering. Yet if we've got some middle class people on sharing about the struggles that they've got, the fears that they've got, and the pain that they've had to deal with, and how God has helped them, hopefully we'll see how the gospel applies to everyone and not just the poor on the council estates.
So Andy will have to stop wearing his Brooks Taverner shirts from now on.
I don't know what that is.
So just thinking about, you guys have been in ministry for a few years now. If a young guy pitched up saying to you he wanted to start church planting, what kind of advice would you give him?
Don't do it. Andy would be more encouraging though, wouldn't you, Andy?
I would put my arm around him, give him a good hug. For me, probably a couple of things. First would be, are you sure you want to do it?
There is a bit of a glamour about church planting these days. I think it's quite a big thing, and I think some people do have a slightly glamorous view of it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not planted a church like Ian has. I've just been involved with revitalizing a church, but even that's had its challenges and difficulties. And we've got, over the years, we've had a good team around us. So I can't imagine what it's like going into a place by yourself and battling away. You have to have, I think, certain giftings to do it, to plant from scratch. And I think particularly anointing, if you want to call it that, to do it as well. So I'll just say, you've got to count the cost, make sure you have good support around you and good accountability. Make sure you understand it's going to be a long-term gain. It's not going to happen overnight. You need to, particularly in scheme ministry, you need to commit to life. Are you willing to die in this place and try and reach people for the gospel? And then just the usual stuff. Be ready for disappointment, struggles, battles, but also remember God is sovereign and that he will save souls if you preach the gospel. And you don't want to paint a total pessimistic view of it, because it is exciting as well, isn't it? It is exciting seeing people saved and the church flourish, and to see the Lord at work. And we should encourage people to plant churches, but just to make sure that they go in with not with rose-tinted spectacles, and make sure that they're equipped, and make sure that they have got good support. I think that's really, really key. I think Ian would say that. Just make sure you've got good support and friends that you can laugh with and cry with, and who get it and who are going to have your back no matter what.
Well, one of the things that always slightly concerns me about all mission work is that there's obviously a pressure to raise money, isn't there? And I sometimes see newsletters from church planters and missionaries saying, we're seeing lots of conversions every month, and you're thinking, there's a pressure to show fruit to get funding almost. I remember when
you obviously haven't read one of my newsletters then.
I remember when Niddrie was being revitalised. I remember hearing a lot of people saying that they were describing something not far off a revival. And I remember thinking, knowing how difficult scheme ministry is, I remember thinking at the time, there's a lot of these people are going to drop off potentially, and so I think there's a real danger with that, isn't there?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
expectation is the biggest killer for church planters. And there's a book I recommend by Stephen Davies. It's about planting churches in urban areas. And if I'd have read his introduction to that book before I planted, I probably wouldn't have planted. But it brought me comfort after planting, because often our expectations are that for funders and for church planters is that if you're doing it right, you're going to see lots of salvation. But the reality is a successful church plant is a church that preaches the gospel in a place where the gospel isn't being preached. And if we start our expectations at that level, we won't be disappointed as church planters or as funders. God does marvelous works. What's happening in Niddrie, I think, is unique. God is using that for bigger purposes than Niddrie. But as a rule, I don't think many church plants or revitalizations will have the success that Niddrie's had. But God is using that to help other church plants like ours. So I think what we'll see is revivals in certain places. There's a perfect storm in Niddrie, isn't there? You've got an awesome team. You've got Mez for starters, which is a great guy at bringing people together. There's Indigenous people. The fact that Andy's moved up there. No one I know will get a team like he's at Niddrie Community Church. So another thing that we shouldn't do as church planters or as funders is set the bar by Niddrie, because Niddrie has got a high bar. So what we should do is say, praise the Lord for what God is doing in Niddrie, but let's be a little bit more realistic what might happen elsewhere. And I think if we did that, we'd be less discouraged, because I'm only 10 years in now and we're smaller than when we started, and I started on my own. Do you know what I mean? So growth isn't an actual outworking of productivity. We meet with 90 people a week who are hearing the gospel that didn't hear the gospel till we got here. So membership size and salvations and baptism isn't the measure of success. Is that church taking the gospel out into a community that wouldn't hear the gospel if that church wasn't there.
I think Med always says this as well, like, for 20 schemes in Scotland, we'll be encouraged if in 50, 60 years we have, 10 or 20 small churches with faithful pastors who've seen conversions in their community. I'm not expecting that every church can have hundreds of people, but just like you said, faithful men and women who are living the gospel, with maybe other believers that have come alongside them to move in, and in some Indigenous converts. Like if we see that in 50 years time, that will be an encouragement, I think. And I think also will change society as well. Same in the north of England. I'm sure in 50 years' time, if you could see 20 revitalizations or just healthy churches in the poorest areas of the north of England, with some faithful men and women who are reaching those estates with some Indigenous converts, will be encouraged by that, and the ramifications will be big in those communities.
I've been thinking a lot about a good friend of mine recently who's terminally ill. He's in a hospice at the moment, but he was a city missionary in West Pilton for 23 years, and it wasn't a church model. It was a different model, but through him, my good friend Benny Anderson was discipled, and Benny Anderson has gone on to reach loads of people for the gospel, and who knows, it might be the means of converting one person or one family that might then go on to have a massive impact.
Amen.
So just to finish up, guys, I know you're busy men, so just a couple of questions to finish off with. Take your pick, either favourite Bible passage, or what's your kind of go-to Bible book, or what's a favourite book after the Bible? Something that's had a big impact on you.
You want to go first, Andy?
Yeah, I'll go for it. Yeah. So, favorite book in the Bible for me is probably the book of Philippians. Just an encouraging letter, but one that, as all the Bible does, commends Christ so highly. But yeah, I love that book. Love preaching that book. Find it encouraging when I read through it. To be honest, outside the Bible, I don't particularly have one book that's stood out. I can't remember what I read. I just.
You'd say lead, Andy. Is that book that you were just tweeting about last month?
Oh yeah, I like that book. Yeah, that. I just kind of whatever I've read, like I enjoyed that, and I just move on to on to the next book. I'm just so stuck in all master stuff at the moment. It's just it's all turning into one thing. So we'll go with Philippians. Philippians is encouraging.
Have you ever tackled Thomas Guthrie's memoirs? No.
No, I haven't, bud. No.
I'll send you a copy of that. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, send me a copy. Is it on PDF?
Stop scrounging. Come on.
Yeah, I'll have a copy. It's about £100 there, man. I was looking online for one.
I've got multiple copies there. I hoover them all up.
All right. Oh, I'll have one. I'll send you you've got a beanie. Send me a book. I'll send you a hoodie as well.
Remember, make it extra large after lockdown. Like, have you got a favourite book, Ian?
Yeah, the Genesis. I think every couple of weeks, I when I was first saved, I used to think I want to read all the way through the Bible, and I'd get the end of Genesis and then miss a few days and think I'm going to have to start again from the beginning. Instead of thinking I'll just start from Exodus, I always went back to the beginning. So I must have read that 100 times, but I love stories. I know it's an historical book, but the narratives in it are awesome. I love it. It's exciting. It's the start of the gospel, isn't it? So I love Genesis. My favourite book out of that would be probably this one, Urban Church Planting, which was by Stephen Davies. I just like the title, Journey into a World of Diversity, Density, and I can't read what the other bit is, but the depravity. And that's a very helpful book for church planters, and to remind us basically that it's our job to preach the gospel and the Lord's job to build his church.
Yeah. Oh, well, listen, guys, it's been great chatting to you both. Just for those who are watching, please remember the work in Niddrie and the work in Middlesbrough. If you're looking for a new challenge, if you want to go and join Ian Williamson in Middlesbrough, I'm sure he'd welcome you with open arms.
Got 2 jobs going at the moment, minister in training and associate pastor.
There you go.
No salary for them, but there's a job.
Raise your own fund.
Lots of cheeky banter guaranteed. So, no, you're both, the work you're doing is incredibly inspiring, and it's encouraging to hear your faithfulness for the long haul. So it's been great talking to you. Thanks for coming on Ragged Theology podcast, and maybe we'll get you back in a few months and we can have another chat. So thanks for coming, guys.
Cheers. Thanks for having us.
Always, bud. Bye.